Welcome to EpiSTEM podcast. This EpiSTEM podcast is brought to you from the National Centre of STEM Education at the School of Education in the University of Limerick. I'm your host, Geraldine Simmie, and I'm the Professor of STEM Education here at the Centre and the Director of EpiSTEM. And my co-host,
Michelle Starr, and I am the Research Liaison Officer in EpiSTEM.
Welcome back, everybody. And today we have a very, very special guest who's actually coming to us from Australia and who's actually in Australia at the moment, Professor Sara Tolbert. And Sara was with us last year as a keynote speaker in our Reimagining Science Education conference, where she had a fantastic keynote address to our conference on reimagining science education, and here at the University of Limerick in EpiSTEM. So we want to warmly welcome you, Sara, to the podcast today.
Thank you, Geraldine. And thank you, Michelle.
Yes, welcome. Yeah, it's great hearing from you, and you're down under and we're up above. That's an awful way of saying it, isn't it, Sara? it gives that context of isn't it?
Depending on how you look at it, right?
That's
exactly.
And
exactly.
it's across the waves, across the water, across the continents. And this is what I think, if I'm right about your work, I think this is something that you have put a huge effort in with people all around the world globally in the last number of years, been involved in that movement to reimagine science education. You have a new lab set up in you. You have just become the Professor and Chair of STEM Education in Monash University, and you have set up a new science education in the Anthropocene Impact Lab. So can you tell us something about that and about your new role?
Yes, of course. Just first of all, thanks again for the invitation to be here. It's really nice to see you both. And it's good to be able to continue the conversation that we started when I was on campus visiting your group. Was it last year?
Yeah, it was actually this time last year.
Yeah, it was last summer. Yeah.
Yes, right about this time last year. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. And I know, I'm a big fan of your work and also of this podcast. I don't think there's another podcast like it right now. And so it's just really exciting for me to be here and be a guest with you all. So I'll tell you a little bit about my new role. I was formerly, as you remember, at Te Whare Wananga o Waitaha, University of Canterbury in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I still have an honorary appointment there as well. And I do a lot of work in Aotearoa, continuing to work looking at the intersection of Mātauranga Māori and science education. But I've recently been appointed to the role of professor here in Melbourne, Australia at Monash University, and I'm leading the Science Education Research Group, as well as co-leading our new Impact Lab, as you mentioned, the Science Education and the Anthropocene Lab, the C Lab, we're calling it for short, and that's with Alan Reed and Connie Circoni. And so the idea behind that lab is just a recognition that there are a lot of us who are coming together saying, it can't just be business as usual in education, or particularly in science education. And we're coming to terms with this moment that many are calling the Anthropocene. We're recognizing that there are these intersecting ecological crises, as well as what some people are referring, because of the multiple crises that we're facing, as a poly crisis, right? And so what does that mean for the way we think about education? And Geraldine, you and I have written about education versus teaching and learning, right? That education is bigger and broader, and it's about social, moral, ethical, political engagement, and rather than just conceptual learning. So those things need to go more hand in hand. And I think that's partly what we're trying to do. So really, it's just this recognition that we're all working in this space. A lot of us are concerned. And so how do we build a movement around this work? How do we build a local, a national, and a transnational movement within science education so that we're all working together to address this quote unquote poly crisis?
Yeah, I think this is a very key question, and I think I like the way you phrase it as a key question for us to ponder across the world and in our institutions and in universities and in higher education spaces and across the globe, because science education has kept itself kind of nice and neatly tucked away around the boundaries of a kind of a tight science, and it hasn't really liked to kind of, if you like, dilute itself by actually bringing in too much of the moral, ethical and political into the space. And so we haven't really inside in science classes taught people, if you like, at a visceral level, how to care for one another and care for the planet, because really the social consciousness of care is not, it's not almost like a rational thing that you can do it like a, you know, a dogmatic image of thought. It's not so much that, it's that effective felt movement that actually makes you step out of your comfort zone and try and do something to make the planet a better place, and to use your science like a sociology project really to make a difference to the world. So I like the way that your group have identified it, that you've worked across the world with people, and that we have it. We're really at a moment, as you say, of the perfect storm in the world at the moment as well, with all the different things happening, that it is forcing us to rethink how we should do this right. Michelle might like to add something there on that as well.
Well, what I think about it is what I would love to ask you first up, Sarah, is because I see what you're doing, and you know, you're bringing in the whole area of your it's about nature. It's coming in with what's happening socially, culturally, politically, then bringing in the history, and in the whole area of science education, which you're really leading this movement, and I love the word movement. When did this spark? Your science education background, you're still in science education, but thinking, as an outlier like this, because I went off to the BSA, the British Sociological Association conference, and spoke in this area about bringing in the critical sociological lens in STEM education. And yourself and Geraldine have influenced me a huge amount in this area. So how did this all begin for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say exactly when and where, but I think it's kind of a culmination of different experiences, including in large part my work with young people. And I think originally as a classroom teacher in New York City, when I started out and just really trying to make sense of what we often characterize as students' quote unquote lack of interest or disengagement with traditional school science. And I actually took an interest in that disengagement as a form of refusal, and have worked with young people, including the students when I was first teaching in New York and then later in Atlanta and in Latin America as well, and being curious about the lack of engagement, and then using as a starting point for more critical pedagogical approach to kind of co-construct experiences in science classrooms that actually mattered to young people. And we had a lot of success in doing this, particularly when I started working with a group of young people and teachers at a school in South Tucson, Arizona, when I was in the USA at the University of Arizona, where we worked to design curriculum in the school that was essentially based on local and global justice issues. And the students at the school, it was a new school, but at the time they were often dispersively positioned as students who don't care about school, that this was a quote unquote alternative school for high school youth who just couldn't cut it in their mainstream school. But it actually wasn't that at all. This school offered a vision for what the staff and teachers at the school referred to as change making. And so in the context of this school being a place for youth leadership development, we thought together about what does that mean for science education. And so from that question that we had, how do we do this? What does it look like? We worked alongside community organizations. We worked alongside tribal leaders. We worked alongside families and staff and the young people themselves to think about and design curriculum experiences for young people that would really engage them in questions of environmental justice, for example, looking at issues of water contamination, water rights, urban heat islands, food justice issues, food security and food sovereignty, and then seeing the difference and looking at international global crises as well. At the time, there was a lot of attention to Ebola, for example, in West Africa. And this was around 2014. And so seeing the way that their interests was ignited, right? And their attendance increased and their sustained interest, I think, was enhanced through these kinds of experiences. And then I worked with a group of young people as part of that research who I would meet with periodically and talk to them about their school science experiences, and just seeing the shift and the change and how they thought about science, the relevance of science to their lives and to their future, I think was a real turning point for me. And I think for everyone who was involved in that project. And from there, continuing to work with teachers, I think we often don't give science teachers enough credit because there's a lot of, there's this narrative that science teachers don't generally care about these issues. They're too focused on their content. But I've had really amazing experiences working with small groups of concerned science educators who just want an opportunity to think together with their colleagues about how we might do this differently.
That's our experience here as well. We've just completed a program on eco-village design, sustainable village design with teachers. We had about 12 teachers in 6 schools, and the students created their own designed an eco-village for Ireland for 2050, but it was to be a science imagination, a STEM reimagining type of project. But the teachers gave so much of their time and interest and did so much. I think as well as a social movement that you're talking about that's happening across the globe, I think it's important for our listeners to also understand that you have actually put a huge amount of academic research into the literature, and that there is actually a growing field inside the academic literature in science education that is reimagining this space, and that there are new special interest groups breaking out at the European Research Association as well. So this is actually, I'm not saying it's got, it's the imprimatur, it's actually properly acknowledged in the academy that this is a space worth talking about. And also you have 2 huge volumes of work done with people around the world on reimagining science education in the Anthropocene. I've read both of the volumes along with a lot of your writing and your research. So I think that it's good for our listeners to know that this is actually not only a movement trying to get away from a stereotype of a scientist and a stereotype of how we do scientific investigation. And of course, the stereotype, I suppose, the man of science from the 18th century was kind of a bespectacled fellow with a white coat on him, probably no hair, probably didn't ever share that he was too emotional. And we have a stereotype of the scientist. And of course, what we've forgotten is that great science always involved marvelous imagination, wonderful intuitive, imagination, people who were able to ask questions outside the box. All of that is what made great science discoveries down through the years. And then we have a history of the women making discoveries, but the men getting the Nobel Prizes. So, I mean, right. So just talk to me about the research side of it, because that's very strong, the knowledge base for this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit to that point you're making about the, imagination and thinking outside the box, and how that has always been part of what it means to do science, but it's not always an element that's made very explicit, I think, especially in school science, and the collaborative nature, the collective imagination that is involved in doing of science and the practice of science. And in school science and even in science education research, I do think there has been, and I was talking with colleagues about this earlier today, a sort of a norming tendency, which is fascinating to me. So there's norming tendency around, this is science education research, which is attention to science practice, right? The idea of thinking and acting like a scientist, or attention, a particular way that we attend to misinformation and disinformation in and through science, a particular way that we think about pedagogical content knowledge. And there's been a norming tendency that I think we need to step outside of, think outside the box. And that's what a lot of this research is doing. Not to say that that's problematic in and of itself, but this moment requires that kind of radical, creative, collective imagination. And that's what the volumes that you mentioned actually are doing. I think it's giving people permission, or not even, it's creating a space, because they've already been doing this work. And so the volumes really are a forum for the people who've been involved in thinking way outside the box about what it means to do science education in the Anthropocene, what it should look like, what it already does look like across these different contexts internationally, transdisciplinary context, and saying this is the kind of radical imagination that we need. And this is what we're seeing from these various approaches. People taking a science fiction or speculative fiction approach to science education, people looking at anti-colonial approaches to science education, people looking at youth participatory science, attending to ongoing systemic issues of environmental justice through school science, and engaging really rigorous science activity within those contexts as well. So yes. I think that the research speaks for itself, right? The fact that we started with a one volume project, we actually never intended it to be 2 volumes, but there was so much interest, which in and of itself is a counter narrative to the idea that there's only one way to think about science education research. And I think you mentioned, Geraldine, that this is growing. This is something that's happening. There is a global movement around this, because there is a widespread and increasing recognition that business as usual is not the way forward.
The business as usual is the issue, and the science teacher, the danger of the science teacher in the stereotype approach is that there's only one right science answer to everything, and that means that you shut down the voices of the students wanting to make their point of view, wanting to share their different types of knowledge that they have, that they already come to the classroom. They're not tabula rasa. They come with knowledge. They come with their values. They come with all of their culture and their context. And so the teachers generally are very, very good at allowing that space to have a freedom in it, whereas a very narrow kind of a defensive view of teaching science would be to shut down their thinking very fast and say to them, oh, well, it's this counterintuitive right answer is all we're going to be talking about today. And so you've shut down a space that should be kept open and problematizing, and you can still teach all your good science, and you can still bring in all of your wonderful theories, and you can still get the students to passionately realise that actually science is an ongoing and a sceptical project that requires people to be passionate and to ask new questions and to think outside the box. Michelle, do you want to add something there?
Well, I do, because what I find, we're talking about your research, what it comes from what you said originally is that relationship, the relational. You valued that, you could see it, you valued the students in New York in the school, where you saw that, okay, how can I bring them along? How can we, incorporate them in the science lesson if they're disengaging? And I think that's a really fascinating approach. And I was looking at your, you have it up on the C-Lab website, your Impact Lab. That you have a great diagram that you follow within your with the whole approach. It's like the purpose within the curricula, the pedagogy is involved, which is a lot of care in it, you can see. But can you tell us about that? I love the pluriversal aspect of it, approach to it, is where you're engaging all those different knowledges. And I know we've spoke about it, but yeah. But it's
right. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I think that builds on this idea of making space for divergent thinking, which I don't think we're doing that well enough. We're putting a box around. We're limiting the divergence, right? Mm-hmm. Within a particular, you can have divergent thinking as long as it builds epistemic agency within this box, this particular box, right? That is what we recognize as science, or what we recognize as science education. And so we need to, again, transgress those boundaries that we've drawn around what counts as science, what counts as science education. And that's part of really attending to divergent perspectives. So even from the students that I talked about at New York City, they're interpreting their disinterest not as disengagement necessarily, but as in and of itself a form of engagement, a commentary, right? And so that engaging, that commentary, that refusal as part of what it means to do science education differently, and think about refusal in that context as actually productive in the classroom space, and not as something that needs to be disciplined in both meanings of that word discipline, right? So I think in terms of the pluriversality, I started thinking about this more deeply in Tucson, Arizona, when I was working in the Indigenous Teacher Education Program at University of Arizona, led by Jeremy Garcia and Valerie Shirley. And I was teaching into the Indigenous Science Methods coursework for teachers who were from American Indian tribal nations around mostly the state of Arizona, and working with those pre-service teachers in the context of a science methods class to really expand what it means to teach science in a way that brings in multiple knowledge systems, or to teach in a science education classroom, because we have to keep in mind science education is not just science, right? It's education. So, exactly. So I think that's critical. That's really important to remember, that I have to remind a lot of colleagues and people I work with of that science education is not just science. Yes. It's something bigger and broader. Yes. And so, and in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and beyond working with the pre-service teachers and also the community partners in the high school science project that I told you about at the Changemaker High School, also looking at colleagues who I worked with in Aotearoa, New Zealand, who I continue to work with, and we're exploring the question of what does it look like to bring Indigenous knowledge alongside science, or to bring science alongside Indigenous knowledge in a quote unquote science classroom? Yes. And that is it's an open-ended question, right? And I think that's the challenge for some of us, is there's a lot of ambiguity around these big questions, what it means to teach science education in the Anthropocene. But I think the three of us see that as an opportunity, right? This ambiguity and opportunity for conversation. So what does pluriversality mean in science education? It means being able to engage with what Georgina Stewart, who's a Māori scholar in science education, calls incommensurability. And Matsuranga Māori, for example, at times is incommensurable with science. And so how do we make space for incommensurability in a science classroom? And I think, again, that's an opportunity, not something that should be foreclosed.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm reminded of, I know you know the work of Donna Haraway as well, that idea of staying with the trouble, that we need to be able to be more comfortable in our understanding of disciplines and interdisciplinary work, so that we can stay with the trouble and make this subject, like, breathe life into the curriculum, and have multiple pedagogies, and teaching science in the outdoor, and have gardens in the schools, and think of it in all those care and justice ways that we can get the debates going in terms of what kind of future we want to have in the world, and play our part with others in that space. So I think that critical social consciousness, you use the work from critical pedagogy, De Sousa's work, you're familiar with Paulo Freire's work with bell hooks. You're also very familiar with all the feminist writers, so that gentle approach of a softer way of looking at care, rather than a more muscular kind of ethic of care. You have the much more a gentle, softer view of actual care being actual, genuine, authentic care of the young person, and all of that. So I think this is going to mean, this conversation we're having today, I'm hoping you'll come on again in the autumn with us, and we'll continue this conversation, Sarah, because definitely our listeners here in Ireland will be very interested, because we have actually new specifications coming in our senior cycle. Science is starting in the autumn. They're causing a lot of stress and anxiety among teachers, because they have a huge percentage of kind of investigative work going to be happening, and the teachers feel unprepared somewhat for assessing and setting up all of those investigations. The teachers, you can feel the anxiety in it. But we also have a fast-changing demographic in Ireland. So, as I said, even in the education system alone, we're actually there's enough, if you like, there's enough push and pull for us to actually be taken out of our comfort zone and try and think of how to do this differently. So, in fact, up until now and before we finish the conversation, we've been talking about it a little bit in theory. So can you tell me, how many student teachers have you got there at the moment? What kind of teachers will you be working with in the year ahead? And how are you planning to maybe do anything different in practice?
Well, those are great questions. I am still getting to know the context here at Monash because I've just started, and it's honestly a huge program. So we have multiple cohorts of pre-service teachers who come through our science education coursework as part of their teacher preparation at the master's level and the undergraduate level. So it's hundreds. When I was in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it was also hundreds, right, who would come through. And for me, it meant completely transforming my own approach to teacher education practice, which I think has been a part of my journey, since working at University of Arizona in the Indigenous Teacher Education Program. And I also taught into the bilingual science program where we taught the coursework in Spanish and English there. And so thinking about not just the translation of the language, but, again, that pluriversal approach to making space for these multiple knowledge systems. In New Zealand, there were a lot of different approaches that I played around with. And I think that part of the process here is being comfortable with being uncertain and being vulnerable. And so I think when we model the vulnerability and the efforts we make at being comfortable with being uncertain, I think that is really helpful. It is hard to embrace that degree of uncertainty, but uncertainty is part of doing science as well, isn't it? In this day and age.
Yes.
So I think the idea of being outside your comfort zone is really important. And in terms of the practicality, there are implications. So again, now, based on, some of the things that I was doing pre-service teacher education, I maybe could come back and talk to you about some of those examples in more depth. But currently I'm working with Karimawana Te Rongo Patahai. She's at University of Canterbury as well. And we're looking at, she's a Māori scholar. And so she and I have been working with teachers from 3 different high schools across New Zealand, including in the North Island and the South Island, who are also on this journey. And so who are also looking at how do we bring Mātauranga Māori and science together in the context of teaching science for the Anthropocene in a high school setting with these really rigid assessment constraints as well. So we have teacher leaders who are our partners, who are willing to go on this journey with us, or who themselves are already on the journey. And we're all working together in a learning community and sharing practices and ideas with each other, and getting ready to document a little bit more formally what it is that they're doing, the different approaches that they're taking. And then next year, we'll be looking at the question of assessment with that group. And that's part of a TLRI, Teaching, Learning, and Research Initiative in New Zealand that we've just started this year as well. So we'll be documenting that as we go through the next couple of years. But the big question for us is assessment, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Yeah, we will be back to you in the autumn, Monash. Yeah, and Michelle, do you want to ask something?
Yeah, I just think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic, and I look forward to hearing about yourself and the student teachers. But what I want to make I loved your paper on Annette Gow's the feminism and not forgetting the work that was put into the ecofeminism. And also your term, I was chatting with Geraldine about this the other day, it's the Trumpocene, its take on the Ampocene, the Anthropocene. But what I can see, what you're doing is it's continuously, and that Trumpocene you're saying it's about forgetting history, forgetting the knowledge where things come from, and it's kind of making it up as anew as we go along. But this whole way of this pluriversal and bringing in the history of science into that whole knowledges, is drawing in from all these knowledges. It's because science never had that. I mean, science forgot about the histories. I mean, as Geraldine was saying, it's like it was putting forward that it's rational subject, but it's science education is man. It's all the knowledge. It's all man made knowledge, or man as in human, not just man. But and I love that the history of science knowledge is within there, and boy, would that engage me as a 15-year-old.
Yeah,
so
for sure,
isn't it?
So important. Yeah. I just wanted to take a moment, and I know we probably have to wrap up soon, but I did want to acknowledge my co-editors on the Science Education and the Anthropocene books, the Reimagining Science Education, Maria Wallace, Jesse Bazul, and Mark Higgins, who that was a labor of love, those 2 volumes. As I mentioned before, we set out to publish one book together, and it ended up being a massive project that lasted for several years, starting in, I think the first book was published in 2021, but I think we started that project in 2019, I want to say, when I just moved to New Zealand. So I just want to give a shout out to my co-editors on that project, who stayed the course. We all stayed the course together. Speaking of collectives,
and we just need to say,
Alan Reed and Connie Zirconi, who are the co-directors of the Science Education in the Anthropocene Impact Lab.
Yeah, and I just want to say as well to our listeners, it's important that those 2 books are on open source, so they're available for anyone to download and read. And boy, are they fascinating.
Yes,
yeah,
and thank you to our libraries, because we had to go and beg for those funds to publish them open access. So thank you very much to our libraries, our university libraries, who funded the open access.
Yeah, and we had a connection, I had a very brief connection recently with Jesse Bazul, because I discovered that he had been in Ireland for some time and had been at the University of Maynooth.
Yes.
And one of our colleagues there, Professor Bernie Grummel, had known his work very well. And I purchased his a recent book on an intense, education as an intense ethical calling. And I mean, the tears nearly rolled down my face reading it. I thought, oh, wow, it's so great to have these, to see the work that's been done. One of the, little essays I've been reading recently is a book of essays by Carlo Rovelli. I don't know if you know his work, and generally on science, and he talks about how science needs philosophy. And I think that this is actually what we're talking about. It's actually just bringing back the social sciences and the arts and the humanities back into science, so that it becomes science education, and you have the transdisciplinarity as you do in the work. And so the universities generally around the world haven't really, they're set up as very masterful places for disciplines, but they will need to grow themselves and change to become places that acknowledge and make, recognition of interdisciplinary work and transdisciplinary work. So I think we're at the beginning of a very interesting movement across the universities as well, because we need that. Science for me always were people who were skeptical. They were humble people who were masters of what they were doing and mistresses of what they were doing. They were always humble enough to, in their ignorance, they knew that they weren't just had the answer to everything. And sometimes in education, reforms disappoint because they present education reforms as if they're prescriptive and thought out, and there's no questions, and they're just a list of attitudes and values and knowledge that you just need to kind of swallow, like as if you're swallowing pills, and take a glass of water with them. So they disappoint really in many ways. So I love that idea of being in the gap between certainty and uncertainty, because how do we prepare young people into an unknown future if we tell them that here, do all of this and you'll be in a certain future? Because that would be a wrong thing to say, and yet we don't want to frighten them, and nor do we need to frighten them about the future. The future is bright, it's transformative, it has got hope and possibility in it, and so they've got to be able to live with the trouble of it, don't they? Can you just talk to me for a minute about that before we wrap up?
Absolutely, and thank you for that, because I think that's a really, really important point. I think for many students to understand that there are communities who have been working on these issues for generations and really making a difference, that this political struggle is not new, that we can become part of collectives. That has been really empowering. I think one of the things that I try to do, and especially with pre-service teachers, is just unpack this idea of the neoliberal subject, that the way you make a difference in the world is by changing your consumption patterns. Now, that's important. It's important to think about ethically about how we are in the world as individuals, but really change comes through community and collective action, right? Or collective, let's work together and come together around this problem, or let's come together and think otherwise about how we want to live and be. And so that has been really empowering for a lot of young people. And I think that's important to remember, that in this idea of entertaining uncertainty, that we're also showing that there's a lot of hope. And again, we've mentioned this before, not naive hope, but critical hope from the perspective of some people have been living their version of the Anthropocene, for example, oppressed communities, for a long, long time. And so there's a lot of knowledge in those experiences that we can draw from. And I think that knowledge is hopeful.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that we're certainly not wanting to continue injustice and inequality in the world. We definitely know the social construction of the world has gone very skewed in the direction of an elite and a technocracy and a kind of an expertocracy, that obviously that if that continues, we'll only be increasing the amount of injustice and inequality. So we definitely have to step up and do new kinds of thinking and work with new collaborators and have new ways of thinking. How does this, how do young people going into a highly scientific and technological world now, how do they not only know their science but actually make a difference to the world they're in? So that is the piece we're after. So I just want to thank you, Professor Sara Tolbert, for being with us today, and say to you, we're extending an invitation to all of our teacher educators and our researchers, both in science education and in STEM and STEAM education here in EpiSTEM at the University of Limerick, to join you and join your lab, and for us to make that a really good connection between our lab and your lab, so that we do that continuing professional development of teachers in that new way, and that we forge that bit of new space together. And we will certainly wish you luck with your colleagues in your new space in Monash and in the University of Melbourne. And we know you will keep in contact with us. Maybe, Michelle, do you want to say anything there?
No, I want to say thank you so much, Sarah, and really look forward to our next conversation. And hopefully you'll be back in Ireland in EpiSTEM in the University of Limerick within the next short while. I won't say maybe a year or whatever, but we look forward to that and to your next conversation. I'll encourage all our listeners to download the Reimagining in Science Education books. They're fantastic read. And
Sarah, do you want to say a word of thanks to anyone else,
yes,
or do you just wrap up yourself?
Yes, thanks, Michelle and Geraldine, and for all the tech support in the background. And also, yes, let's keep up this conversation. Let's continue the collaborations, because honestly, that's what our lab is about. It's really about making these connections, about opening up these conversations. It's about working with teachers. I think one of the things that we're looking at right now as a next step is looking at teacher education practice. And I think that would be a really wonderful opportunity to collaborate with EpiSTEM, because I know you're looking at similar types of approaches to science education reform, is focusing on teacher education practice.
Yes.
So that would be an opportunity for us to continue these conversations.
Yeah, wonderful. And we will continue the conversation in Copenhagen at the end of August. I look forward to seeing you.
We will.
The European Science Education Research Association, our former director of EpiSTEM, who is now the Professor of Science Education and STEM Education at the University of Oxford, Sybil Ergeran, will be there. So she's doing some very good work now on future science thinking, and so we look forward to being with her. I'm bringing over with me one of our postdoc graduates here, Dr. Vo Van De. He's from university, he's from Vietnam, and he's been working on simulations in physics, getting young people interested in examining their own physics through lovely simulations and getting good feedback and doing nice digital work and enjoying that space. So we look forward to seeing you in Copenhagen, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the autumn on the podcast. Take care, and take care for now.
Enjoy the evening.
Yeah. Bye-bye, Sarah.
Have
Bye-bye.
a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye. Our musical selection today then is a waltz called Tears. It's written by Jerry Holland in Cape Breton in Canada and is played on fiddle now by Avril McLaughlin. And now Avril will take it away and play the waltz called Tears.